So the rest of this chapter, I'll just fly through. I won't test you on it, but you'll have questions in the homework about it. So I'm not going to put that much emphasis on this, but I think it's important to at least take a quick look at. So, like I said, these things will be something that you can get online, download the PowerPoints, so you don't need to take notes for this one. So they label this section as critical thinking, and they want you to whenever you look at a statistic report, you should look at how they're studying, and how they're presenting their data. And so it's important to be critical about how people might be able to misuse statistics, either accidentally or purposely for their own benefits. So what does that mean? So here are some examples of misuses of statistics. And they give 5 examples here, but there are many more examples that people can come up with. So samples. Finding a bad sample is a misuse of statistic. So, for example, let's see if I can think of an example. Here, an example that they give here is voluntary sample. So if you want to, let's say if I want to find out some information about all the stats students, and I send an email, and then the people that respond are the people that are volunteering to respond their information, but the people who don't respond are out of my sample. So if I want to know what people think about my stats class, and I send it out to you guys, and usually the happy people are the ones that would respond. And if they didn't really care about the stats class, they wouldn't respond. And so that would be an example of a voluntary sample where I'm only soliciting from people who want to tell their story. And so depending on what the situation is, I'm probably not going to get a representative sample. Yes, very much so. Surveys are examples of voluntary responses. If they force you to take the survey somehow, then yeah. But sometimes it's good because it's collecting. Sometimes your sample might be too small, in which case that's not a good sample either. If I want to represent all of Cañada College students and I collect information from 5 students, that's not going to be representative. So the idea behind statistics, a good statistical survey or good statistical study, is that you want to get a sample that is representative of all the population. And 5 out of 6,000 is not representative. Graphs. Sometimes you can misuse the graph. If you take a look at this left graph, you say, whoa, that's really close to each other. If you take a look at this graph on the right, whoa, there's a big difference between them. These two represent the same numbers, right? 32,000, 30,000. What's the difference between them? This one starts with 0. The other one starts at 30,000. So they take a different sort of snapshot and things get exaggerated somehow. So that's another example of a misuse of a graph. If you're going to use a graph, usually, and you know, this is an example of a ratio level data, because dollars, we're talking about dollars, and $0 certainly makes sense, right? So if you're going to use a ratio level data, then you should always include your 0. And for those times where you don't include 0, you should really point that out, although you shouldn't represent graphs that don't include 0, where 0 should be included and it's meaningful. So here's an example, graphical example of a misuse of statistics. Here's another one where they talk about pictographs. Usually when you represent things in 3 dimensions, people tend to look at the volume more so than like the area or the length. Here, it's simple enough to look at, you know, the length of the area. It just goes up. Here, volume. Well, this looks like it's twice. It's like, 5 out of 20 is like a quarter, but this looks like it's way bigger than a quarter, right? This is like a quarter of it, and this is clearly not looking like a quarter of it. So when you introduce volumes there, you have to be careful about representing your graph. Or when you're the consumer, you're receiving the statistic, and you're looking at this. This could deceive you really quickly. This looks like it's more than a fourth of this big thing over here. So another thing to be careful about. Percentages. 110% doesn't make sense. Those sports interviews when people give 110%? Yeah. When you say 110%, that is still mathematically meaningful. Like your tuition can go up 110%. And that's a lot. So that is meaningful. When we talk about effort, that's a little shaky. So here are some examples. There's a lot more examples that they have in the book, and there's an actual book that says, I think the title of the book is How to Lie with Statistics, and they talk about all the misuses of statistics there. The other one is design of experiments, which goes back to the idea of finding a good sample. Sample is not collected properly or appropriately. They say it's basically a useless piece of information. So they talk about observational studies and experiments. An observational study is something that you look at from a lens point of view, and you're just going to let whatever it is that they're doing, and you're just going to study them. So an example would be just taking a snapshot look at let's say I'm teaching this class as a hybrid class, and I'm also teaching a fully online class. Well, fully, and so that's not a good example. I don't know. Well, an example would just be if I want to look at things and not change anything. So let's say this class, if I just want to see how you guys do as a class, I'll just take a look at your final grades at the end. Now, an experiment would be something where you would do something intentionally to a particular group, and then you try to see if the outcomes change. So an example of this class would be, let's say this half of the class over here, I give them some special treatments and, tell them that if you guys want to use Excel, I'll let you use Excel for the exams. And I just do that with half the class. And then the other half of the class, I say, no, you can't use Excel. You can just use your calculators. So what I'm doing is I'm applying a special treatment, I guess in different levels there, special treatment. But I'm applying a treatment to a portion of my sample and not applying it to another portion of my sample. And then I'm going to compare the difference between those two at the end. So that's an experiment, is when I intentionally modify something that I'm doing. Okay, we won't be doing experiments in this class. All the stuff that we're using are techniques for observational studies. Okay, experiments would be something that you would probably do in psychology class or something. Right. But you would intentionally be interfering so that you can report on a specific change. Like if I'm interested to see how effective Excel is, then I would probably do this experiment. I would say, okay, this half of the class you guys are going to do Excel. This half you can't use Excel. And so I'll compare, and then in my experiment I'll say, well, the people that did Excel did way better, so maybe I should start using Excel in my class. So there's something intentional in the experiment. It might seem a little deceiving and or something like that, but there's some meaningful experiments where they test things. Aspirin. They give aspirin to people, and they call them placebos, where they the people think that they're taking aspirins, but it's really just a sugar pill, and there's nothing in there. So what they do is they gave an experiment. They did an experiment like that, and they found out that the people that took aspirin lowered their heart rates or their rates for heart attacks, and so now it's used in some for certain people who have a high rate of heart attack. High rate? Yes. Risk. Thank you. And they have some other types of studies here that I think I can just pass over, and we can be done with this section now, or this chapter. So there's all kinds of other stuff to look at that might be interesting. But like I said, we're not going to focus on that in our exam. So I'm more focused in having you think about the things that I think are important for the exam. These are important, but in most stats classes, mathematical stats classes, they're really not stressed that much. Okay, let's move on to chapter 2.
So these pages are on which web access or
The pages that I wrote on, they will be in web access. But the original slides you can download from the multimedia library in my math lab.
So both?
Well, the ones in my math lab won't be annotated, so they'll just be the original slides. Okay? Web access would have these slides that I write on. So from here on out, usually the first section in the chapter would just be an overview, and I'm usually just going to skip that. It's a good thing to do. You just read over, when you're reading the book, just read over the overview, and then just to get an idea of what you're going to be up to. But because it's really just an overview, I'm going to skip it. So the main aspects of this chapter would be looking at how to define frequency distributions, histograms, and some statistical graphs. I don't think we'll go over this too much, but we'll take a quick look at some of the graphs that we're gonna be doing. Histograms is a type of graph, and then there are a few others that that I think are going to be important, and we'll go over them. So overview. We're going to want to look at the idea of a center of a particular data set. We're going to look at how things vary, and then we're going to look at the general description of the distribution. We're going to define outliers. And the time-changing characteristic, I don't think we'll be talking about that too much. But center, variation, distribution, and outliers would be the terms, the important terms that we're going to be studying in this class. So, frequency distribution. We'll take a look at what a frequency distribution is. And a lot of this now is going to focus on quantitative data, numerical data. So if you have a large data set, sometimes it's good to be able to look at the big picture. And when all you see are a bunch of numbers, the idea of a big picture doesn't make sense. So we want to arrange it somehow so that we kind of see the big picture. And the first type of big picture to look at is the frequency distribution. Now, frequency distribution is a table that has two columns. It has a column. The first column has the range of data, and then the second column has what we're going to call the frequency. So computers, software calculators can generate frequency distributions really quickly. We're going to learn how to do this on a graphing calculator as well. So how do you design or construct a frequency distribution? So a frequency distribution lists values either individually or by groups of intervals. So when they talk about intervals, then you're looking at an interval type data. So you're looking at a quantitative type of data that talks about how many of these things that we collect lie in a specific set of data or a specific group. So in a way, you're categorizing it, but the categories are usually a range of values. So here's an example that they have, and I think this is an example that's listed in the opening header of Chapter 2. They collected the ages of Academy Award winners and separated it into male and female. But they're gonna for these examples they're gonna focus on actresses. So they're gonna focus on actresses. But there's something interesting if you look at the difference between actors and actresses, their ages. What do you think? I think Academy Award winning women are younger than Academy Award winning men. You know who that was? You remember? Was it? Did she win? I thought it was in Golden Pond or something. A lot of you guys probably don't know. Eh? We just aged ourselves. Anyways. Yeah, if you compare, just compare directly the ages, there's a 22-year-old versus a 44. Older men seems to be a little bit more distinguished than older women, I guess. I don't know. But that's society, and that's another topic. So what we want to do is we want to be able to construct frequency tables. So one way to construct a frequency table is to, or a way to construct a frequency table is to get a range of ages. And the range of ages has to be consistent. Otherwise, your frequency distribution is not going to be represented correctly, and this would be another example of a misuse of statistics if you don't have the same amount of ranges between. So all the ranges here are a range of between 21 and 30, between 31 and 40, 41 and 50. So it's important to note that there's some consistency there. And then I'm gonna let me focus on, as an example, the 51 to 60 range. And what you would do with all the data that you would have collected is that you would read through every single number in the data and mark off all the numbers that go between 51 and 60, including 51 and 60. So as I read through these numbers, there's a 60 right here. Where? Third row? 54, right? So if I scan through this, of course a computer would do this a lot better, right? If I scan through this and I look at the numbers that are between 51 and 60, I find 2 of them. So I would say the frequency is going to be 2 for that range. And so that's what they do here. Between 21 and 30, they would pick off all those numbers that are between 21 and 30, and at the end of the day, they got 28 of them. So there's 28 women aged between 21 and 30 inclusive, and so that's the number you would put in your frequency. So that's how they create a frequency table. So even before they create this frequency table, let's establish some important definitions or vocabulary. So focusing on that frequency table, and you kind of know where it came from, right? Frequency table has what we will call lower class limits. So the lower class limits are going to be these numbers that are the lowest numbers for each range of values. I guess we should define class as well. So a class is a group of values. In this case, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So in our example, there are 6 classes that we have. Sometimes they use categories or groups, but in this book they focus on the word class, so we'll use the word class. So the lower class limits are the values that are lower end of those. And so the other side of that would be the upper class limits. So the upper class limits are the largest value in each class. And so when we're collecting data, we're looking at all those numbers between the lower class limit and the upper class limit, but we're also including the lower class and the upper class limits. So those two terms are fairly clear, right? Now let's get into some terms that are not so clear. Class boundaries. Class boundaries are numbers used to separate the classes. What? But without gaps created by class limits? So if you take a look at the class limits here, the upper class limit for the first class is 30. The lower class limit for the next class is 31. So in my number line, my number line would look like this. Well, I probably have more numbers, but I'm just looking at between 30 and 31. What I want to do is I want a separator that would separate those two classes. And so that would be called the class boundary. So the class boundary would be these numbers that would be in between an upper class limit and a lower class limit from one class to the next. The only weird part about this is that when we're talking about boundaries, then we should be talking about boundaries we should be talking about the boundaries all the way to the outside. So not only should we be talking about boundaries between classes, like 30.5 is that number between 30 and 31 that we were first looking at. And then 40.5 would be the number between these next two classes. 50.5, 60.5, etc. Now there's these two other boundaries that describe the uppermost and lowermost boundary for the whole data set. And what you would do is you would basically find the boundary between the first class and the second class. So there's a 30 and 31. You find the average between them, that's 30.5, 30.5. And you know that you're going to move half a unit from the upper class limit to the boundary and the lower class limit to that boundary. So by moving that half a unit, you're also going to establish the boundary for the lower class and the boundary for the uppermost class. And that would be moving another half a unit, because that's how many units that you moved over. And just to be able to put a boundary over each individual class. So if we're looking at boundaries for all these classes in between, we would be able to encompass all those classes in between. Now, if we don't have this boundary over here, then this first class doesn't have a boundary in the bottom. Purpose of a boundary would be in more mathematical sense if you were to use Excel. And you usually would use bins, but sometimes you might be interested in trying to cover every single number that's between these things. And so when we start looking at numbers that have decimals, you want to make sure that you have a separator, a single number separator that would separate one class from the other class. And so the single number separator would be basically the average between an upper class limit and a lower class limit of the next class. So the average between 50 and 51 is 50.5. That's a number right in between them. And so that would be your separator that would separate them. No? You guys aren't happy with that?
But how do lower class, upper class values differ? There's no higher than the average of it. So why did 8.5 or 8.5 to some other arbitrary number?
I suppose it could be some arbitrary number, but just to be consistent, the class boundary between classes over here they look at the distances between the upper class limit and the class boundary, which should be the same as the lower class limit and the same class boundary for the next class. And so they just figure that's a 0.5 step, so they're going to do a 0.5 step to the other side just to make it as even as possible. So these intervals over here that we're looking at are all exactly the same interval.
Those people aren't on the dot here.
Yeah, that's correct. But, well, the most practical application, I don't know if this is much more practical, is that if you're actually just trying to draw a graph of it, the next thing that we're going to cover is what's called a histogram. And the histogram would be something like this, a connected bar graph, where these numbers would have some sort of significance. Like, how would you label these numbers? Well, these numbers are going to be exactly the class boundaries, 30.5. Because you can't label it 30, you can't label it 31. That number over there is going to have to be labeled as something between 30 and 31 because it separates those two things.
So we're talking about factors and stages. It seems like you just put it in like a percentage.
Well, not a percentage, but you're looking at an average. So that's the thing. We talked about discrete values. We talked about like the number of household that we have, and so that's, you know, when the census comes around, they say, or when you say the number of eggs, that's another example of a discrete value that we got, right? The number of eggs that a hen lays. So if you're looking at a whole chicken coop with hens laying eggs, you want to know the average amount that each hen lays, right? And so you would collect all these 10 chickens or whatever in this coop, and you would average them. So the average would be like each hen lays about 3.5 eggs. Well, that idea that the half doesn't make sense there, but it's a statistic that we're going to use to represent the amount of eggs that a hen lays.
It's like when we say the average family has 2.5 children.
Yeah, 2.5 children. Right. You're not going to have 2.5 kids, but that's the statistic that comes out. And so these class boundaries can be described as a statistic as well. All right? If you're not happy with it, hopefully after we talk about histograms, it'll make a little bit more sense. Midpoints. Midpoints would just be the average between the upper class limit and the lower class limit. And when I say average, I have to eventually redirect that word into saying mean, because the word average is going to have several meanings in our class. So mean, the mean, and you find the mean by adding the number and dividing that by the number of numbers. That's how we kind of learned average. But that's what that is. You add the lower and upper class limits for each class, and then you divide it by 2. So why is this important? Sometimes they call it the class midpoint. Sometimes it's also called the class representative. Because it kind of represents the whole class. It's a one number representation of the whole class.
Like the average number of students.
Or the average age of all the actresses in this class. Yeah. And so for some reason, if you need one number for that particular data point, then the representative would be the best way to represent. That's why it's called the representative. Okay. The next one is a class width. Now this is an important definition because this is how a lot of things usually are defined, or how the frequency table is made. And the class width, for this to be a properly presented statistic, you should have the same class width for all your classes. And the class width is not 30 minus 21. What's 30 minus 21? 9. That's not the class width. The class width is the difference between 2 consecutive lower classes or 2 consecutive upper classes. That's the class width. And that's important when you're building your frequency table. Okay? So any questions? All right. So those are the basic definitions, the different aspects, and then the vocabulary that we're going to be using to describe frequency tables. Class width, lower class limit, upper class limit, class boundaries, and class midpoints. Now, I think we talked about this at the beginning, so it pops up here again. Reasons for constructing a frequency table. sometimes your data set is so large that it's hard to get an idea of how things look. But if you have a frequency table, like for this, the actresses' ages, you can clearly see there's 28, and then there's 30, and then there's 12, and after that there's 2, 2, 2. So the concentration of ages of Academy Award-winning actresses are more concentrated to below 40. You can kind of see that just by looking at this. Whereas if you were to look at the original data set, it's just a whole bunch of numbers. It's hard to get that insight just by looking at all those numbers. So a frequency table gives us a quicker insight, especially with large data sets. And it also leads us to constructing our first type of graph. Which is a histogram. Okay. So how would you construct a frequency table? Organize the data. So one of the first things that you need to think about is how many classes should you have? Depending on how big your data set is, that should give you an idea between, like, as to how many classes you should have. They suggest, these are all suggestions, by the way, they suggest that you should have between 5 and 20 classes. Anything less than 5 classes wouldn't give you something too meaningful, but if you don't have that much data, maybe you might just get stuck with 3 classes, and then that's all you got to do. You shouldn't have more than 20. If you have more than 20, then it looks kind of confusing and stuff. How would you approximate your class width? This is if you're doing it by kind of like by hand or by scratch. How would you approximate class width? One way to do it is to find the largest value and the smallest value, and then if you figured out that you wanted like maybe 10 classes, you would find the min and max divided by 10, or take the difference and then divide it by 10, and then that would be your approximate class width. Again, only a suggestion. The way I'm going to ask you to construct a frequency table in a test situation, in a quiz situation, probably would be I would probably give you the class width and then get you started with it that way. Your starting point, the lowest value you have should probably be your lower limit for the first class, and then you would use your class width to figure out the lower limit for the next class. And so along the way you would establish your upper and lower classes for each class, and then once you have that, you just tally up the numbers. Let's see if we can find a homework problem that does something like this. I suppose I could just do one of the other examples that they have, huh? Let's see. I don't know if this is what I want to do, but Let's see if we can construct a quick frequency table out of this best actors list over here. So there's a 30. There's anybody in their 20s? 29. So we could start with 29, or we can make it simpler for ourselves and start with 0, or not 0, 20, or 25. So what should we start with, 20? Or 20 seems like it's nice and easy. So now we can look at the largest value. So if we follow their guidelines, like I said, their guidelines are just suggestions, and I don't know how reasonable it is to follow their guidelines, but let's follow their guidelines. So what is the smallest value? And their largest value?
Oh, 76.
76. And let's figure out this. I didn't count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there's about 75, 76 of these numbers. So how should we break this up? How many classes should we have? 5 or 6 classes? Let's go with 6 classes. So according to what they suggest that we take the difference between them and divide by 6 classes, right? So 76, this, by the way, is your class width. So 76 minus 29 divided by 6. So anybody have a calculator handy?
7.8.
What is it? 7.8. So for class width, I would probably want to use a whole number, so I'd probably just go with 8. So let's use 8 for the class width. So what did they say in the instructions? They say figure out your lower class limit. Now 29 might be a good place to start, or you can start earlier than that if you want. So that's kind of up to us. But let's start with 29. Now, if I want my class width to be 8, what's 29 plus 8? 37. So am I going to write 37 here? Where am I going to write 37? For the next class. 37. Right? It's so the idea behind the class width is the class width, remember, is a difference between 2 consecutive lower class limits or 2 consecutive upper class limits. So if this is 37, that means the upper class limit for the first class should be just the number before that. And since we're dealing with whole numbers, the number before that would be 36. Now, how should I fill up the rest of this? Adding the class width, but adding it going down. So 37 plus 6 by 8. 45 plus 8. 45, 53, 61, 69. When do we stop, by the way? 77. So would 77 be the next one? And the upper class limits?
52.
So from 36 you would add 8, right? What is it?
Oh, 44 and then
44, 52. So you can keep adding 8, or you can just look at the lower class limit and subtract 1. So 60, 61 minus 1 is 60. 69 minus 1 is 68. So there's these are basically patterns that you would try to get. This one you can't subtract because you don't know what the next class is. So what is this one? 84. So that's how you build your classes, and after this you just tally up the numbers. So this is the hard part. This is where a computer would do more efficient work than humans.
Well, he said the class was 6.
Well, 8, sorry, the class width was 8.
But how many rows do you have? Was that supposed to be 6?
That was the number of classes that we had. Was supposed to be 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. No, I mean you're off by 1, so it doesn't matter. Yeah. These are all have tildes and stuff, so they're all approximations. And we didn't get the exact numbers of classes because we rounded up from 7.8 to 8. And so when you do that, there's going to be some little minor differences.
And I have to guess how many classes?
Yeah. Well, if you were building your own frequency table, yeah. And you would what?
Would you end up being completely off?
Well, I don't think you'll be completely off. I think you'll just have what? You'll just cross them out, right? So, but the thing with ages and with numbers like this, it's usually best to go with starting with a class width of 10 and go by tens. And so, like I said, their outline over here is just a suggestion, wherever it is. This is just a suggestion of how to build a frequency distribution, but you might have to, in some cases, use your own judgment as to what probably would be the best way. Like when I calculate your grades for your exams, I usually go by tens. And so I disregard, their suggestion and I start with 10, 20, 30, depending on what the lowest score is. And then I just go by tens. So from here, you just tally up how many ages are between 29 and 36. So you would just go through and figure out, cross it out, and count. Okay? So it's this is the end of this class. We weren't able to finish this section, so what I'll do is I'll take a look at it tonight and see if it's worth finishing. If it is, then we'll spend a little bit of time finishing this, and then before we go on to Chapter 3. It would be good if you guys can start your homework, and what I'm going to do is for the first 15 minutes of class, I'll probably try to answer some homeworks, but I'll need to cut it off. If there are more questions, we'll have to find other ways to answer it because we need to go on with more material. Okay? So hopefully by next time you'll be logged on to my math lab, ready to go, and welcome to the class.